everyone, how's it going? Forrest here again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at O hilf, Christe, Gottes Sohn, which translates to O help, Christ, Son of God. This chorale is actually a little interesting. Again, we're continuing the few chorales that extend beyond Bach's vocal section of the BWV numbers. That is to say that this actually is part of a lost or incomplete vocal work or large ensemble work, including voice by Bach, the St. Mark Passion. This was a chorale that was found in the surviving pasticcio. But other than that, it's a very interesting chorale, similar to the last chorale that I analyzed. This chorale has some curious chordal moments and some unique chord progressions that are just not very Bach in terms of the harmony I'm used to analyzing, which brings into question whether or not the harmony is Bach's doing. This could be someone else's harmonization. After all, the St. Mark Passion was never completed by Bach. So with that being said, we're just going to hop right into the analysis. We have two flats in the key signature. We start on D major, and interestingly we end on D major, so I reckon we're in the key of G minor here, and we're just starting on our dominant. We then get B flat, G, B flat, and D, which is our tonic in first inversion, G minor over B flat. We then have F sharp, D, A, and D, another 5 chord, this time in first inversion. And then we get G minor, G, D, G, and B flat, tonic triad, root position. We get ready for a bit of an interesting half cadence here. We have E flat, G, G, and C. I'm inclined to say this is a 4/6 chord. A is a non-chord tone. C is a chord tone. B flat is a passing seventh. And D is a passing tone as well. So we get, on the next beat, we get C, C, E flat, and B flat. I think this B flat is kind of operating as a 7/6 suspension over the bass, or more just like an accented non-chord tone. It's actually this A that's the root of the chord, making this a 2/6 chord, A diminished over C. We know that Bach loves 2/6 chords, especially in cadential contexts, but you could potentially analyze this as an incomplete C minor 7 chord as well. They both more or less function in the same way. And then we end the phrase with D major. D, A, D, and A. That's right, there's no third in this chord, it's an open fifth, but we're going to use our deductive reasoning based on what we can expect our D chord to be from previous iterations of D chords in the chorale, and cadencing on these open fifths does bring into question, whether or not Bach composed this chorale, because open fifths are relatively rare in Bach's chorale writing, and usually when you do see open fifths in Bach, I'd say that they coincide with music that has instrumental accompaniment as well, so the instrument may be filling out the third, making the vocal score an incomplete harmony. You have to take the instrument into context as well, but just with the voices here, we have an open fifth. Granted, this chorale could have had instrumental accompaniment if it were in the St. Mark Passion. That is to say, if it were like any of the other chorales we would see in Bach's complete passions, the John and the Matthew. But moving on to the next phrase, we stay in the key of G minor. We get some interesting harmony as well. We get another half cadence. We start off with G minor, G, G, D, and B flat, root position. Then we get E flat, G, E flat, and C, C minor over E flat. And then we get a really interesting progression here. We have B natural, D, F, and D. And that is B diminished, which is 7 of 4. And that gets kind of inverted on the next, or the end of the beat. D, B natural, D, and D. It's not completely spelled, so I'm not going to include it, but it takes us to another dominant. We have F, G, B natural, and D, which is G7 over F, which would just be 5, 4, 2 of 4. And again, and I say again because I've mentioned this several times in my videos, when we get 7 going to 5, especially when they have this common F as their denominator, really it's just a big dominant section, and we're getting a tonicization of presumably the next chord happening over 2 beats. I don't think we've modulated to C minor by any means. It's just a coincidence that it's being preceded by C minor. This B natural is just, I think, there for effect. We're getting this dominant arpeggiation in the lower 3 voices, which just changes the narrative of what that D is doing in the melody. But we don't get C minor as our resolving chord. In fact, we get a chord that's quite distant from C minor. It shares C in common, but it is an F sharp diminished chord. We have F sharp, A, and C, which is just our 7 chord in root position. 2 7 chords in root position in close proximity to one another, which is very interesting. But what I think is happening here is the secondary dominant is implying 4, and instead of going to 4, the dominant is of 4, and it's as if 4 had already happened. We see some truncated or elided progressions like this in Bach from time to time, where the dominant implies the chord. The dominant can only really go to one place, theoretically speaking, and because it implies that one resolution, Bach just skips it entirely, and 4 would, typically speaking, want to go to 7. But another interesting about this progression is that this chord is a 4-2 chord, and we would expect 4-2 chords bare minimum to resolve down by step in the bass. So we would expect this F to go to E flat, but we see an ascending chromatic bass line here, which is quite unusual. But here we see it. It's very interesting. Wonder why whoever composed this did that. I guess we'll give this chorale the benefit of the doubt and say that Bach did compose it, but it's quite interesting, some of the chordal choices that were made, even in the previous phrase. Yeah, that's as much as I have to say about that. G, B flat, G, and B flat. 2 roots, 2/3 spelling of our tonic triad. C sharp's an enchord tone. E is an enchord tone. We have a diminished 5th leap there. Every harmony teacher is at the edge of their seat right now. But no, I'm only teasing. We have C sharp, E, G, and A, which is A7 over C sharp, 5-6-5 of 5, because A is the dominant of D, and this is just a substitute for A diminished, where we get the raised 7th and raised 6th scale degrees, sorry, which create a dominant of our dominant D major, D, A, F sharp, and A. Next phrase leaves us with some room to interpret. I think you could analyze this as an imperfect authentic cadence, but I think actually what's happening here is a half cadence, and I'm going to analyze it as such just because of the way the harmony works and what I expect from Bach, but I think you could analyze this in the key of G minor as well. But starting things off, we have G minor, like we started our previous phrase. G, B flat, D, and G, root position. Then we get D, A, D, and A again. Very interesting, open 5th, D major. Then we get G, G, D, and B flat, tonic triad, root position again. A passing chord here with all 4 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm. We know that usually that indicates that there is a subdivided chord progression happening, and in fact that is what's happening here. We have A, F sharp, C, and A, which is 7-6. And we know when we have 1 going to 7-6, usually 1-6 is following the 7-6 chord. B flat, G, B flat, and G. G minor over B flat without the 5th, but it's the least important contextual tone, and it is often omitted from chords, especially in Bach's writing. But after our normal pattern here of 1 going to 1-6 via 7-6 chord, we get B natural, along with G, D, and G, which is our tonic operating as the dominant of the dominant here. This would be 5-6 of 4, similar to how we saw previously, and we actually get that resolution this time, C, G, C, and E flat. We have a passing 7th here in the melody as well, so that's our 4 chord. And I do think just because of this G major chord here, And actually what I'm realizing now is it wouldn't be an imperfect authentic cadence, it would be a plagal cadence, because C minor is our 4 chord in the key of G minor, not our 5 chord. We have a passing tone here in the tenor as well, but I do think G major is our dominant now because, for one, it's major. So I feel like it's operating as a dominant. And 2, a typical hallmark of the half cadence, and we've seen 2 previously, is the 5th of the chord in the melody. This isn't always the case by any means, but it tends to be the case with the majority of the half cadences I've come across. So in Bach's writing, of course. So that is an interesting twist at the end where Bach shifts to the key of the subdominant. And I think Bach stays in the key of the subdominant through the next phrase. It's almost as if each phrase has something more and more interesting to try and one-up the previous phrase, which is very unusual. So we start the phrase off with B flat, D, B flat, D, and F, which is B flat major over D, or 7/6. You could also analyze this as 5/6 of 3. I know the first textbook that I studied from analyzed 7 chords a lot of the time as 5 of 3, but I found with Bach that 7 doesn't always go to 3. It often does, but it doesn't always, so I don't think the analysis is accurate 100% of the time, but here we see it operating in that fashion, or at least it's about to operate in that fashion. We have B flat, D, and F afterwards, which is just taking the chord and putting it in root position, and then we get E flat, B flat, D, and G. E flat major 7, which is 3/7 in the key of C minor. Passing tone here in the tenor, anticipation here in the alto, leaving us with E flat, A flat, C, and G. A flat major 7 over E flat, that's 6/4/3. 3 wants to go to 6. This effectively looks like a cycle of falling fifths progression for the time being. However, 6 is going to be a gateway to an otherwise ascending chromatic baseline progression, which typically consists of secondary leading tones bridging together the natural minor scale, where we have E flat, F, and G, but the melodic minor tones are operating as secondary leading tones. For example, E natural, G, C, and G. That's C major. I think in the key of C minor, C major is probably operating as a secondary dominant. You could see this at the end of the phrase as a Picardy third, maybe. You could even see it in the middle of the phrase as a tonic if it's operating as such, but especially considering the fact that F minor is the following chord, it makes sense that this is operating as 5 of 4. And then we get our 4, F, A flat, C, and F. It's in root position as well. F is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. And then we get F sharp, A natural this time, C, and E flat, which is F sharp fully diminished 7th, which in the key of C minor is a secondary leading tone chord. It is the leading tone chord of 5, because F sharp is our leading tone in the key of G minor, and G is our 5. But what's most interesting about this phrase, and sort of what brings into question whether or not this is a half cadence, or whether or not this is an authentic cadence, it would be an imperfect authentic cadence. The reason why I feel like this is a half cadence is because, for the same reason that the previous phrase felt like a half cadence, this one does. However, instead of having B natural, we have B flat, which would make this a minor half cadence, which is unusual, but I think it's still operating as our 5 chord nonetheless based on the way that I hear it. But on top of that, there's some voice crossing going on here, where we see the B flat of the alto sing above the D in the melody. But in the same way that we could argue that this is a half cadence being flipped at the last second in the key of C minor, we could make the argument that this is being flipped at the last minute in the key of G minor. It just sounds more C minor-like to me, just because of this arrival at G in the bass that feels like it just wants to resolve down to C. That's just my opinion. That's just the way that I hear it. This is just one of those unusual cadences that has ambiguity to it and has a bit of qualities borrowing from both of the cadences. So whether you analyze this in the key of G minor or whether you analyzed it in the key of C minor, I think both have validity. This is kind of common to how the harmony operated in the last episode as well. Moving to the next phrase, we have movement back to the key of G minor, and we end with a deceptive cadence where we get E flat here at the beginning, E flat, G, G, and G. Very interesting here where we have the triple G, but really it's just two Gs because the alto and the soprano are singing the same G. In the key of C minor, sorry, I was getting ready for what it's going to be. In the key of C minor, this is our 3 chord. And in the key of G minor, it is our 6 chord. We then get A, C, and F sharp diminished over A, that's 7, 6. And then we get B flat, D, D, and G, which is 1, 6, G minor in root position. D is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. And then we get C, C, E flat, and A, which is A diminished over C. It's a 2, 6 chord. And then we get a continuation of this adjacent progression here. We get D, B flat, D, and B flat, which is B flat major over D. That's 3, 6. There's an argument to be made here that this could be a rootless triad as well, and this could be a 1, 6, 4 chord, but I don't really think that that's what's happening. We have 3 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm here. E natural is a non-chord tone, G is a non-chord tone, C is a non-chord tone. With the B flat here in the melody, this is C major 7, C dominant 7, E natural, and B flat, which is a byproduct of the melodic minor scale. And as you can see here in the alto, we have some melodic minor going on. And then we have D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our 5 chord root position. And we would expect this to resolve to G minor, but instead it resolves to E flat major, the same E flat major that started the phrase. E flat, G, G, and G. 1 root and 3/3, or I guess technically 2/3, because the soprano and the melody are doubling the the soprano and the melody are the same thing. The soprano and the alto are singing in a unison. But moving to the next phrase, we get a half cadence and a mid-phrase modulation as well. You can make the argument we stay entirely in the key of G minor here. However, I think it's hard to argue that the beginning of the phrase doesn't sound B flat major like. So I'm going to analyze it in the key of B flat, but we will eventually wind up back in the key of G minor. So I think E flat's also operating as our 4 chord. Sorry, I wrote a 6. I flipped my numbers around. A 4 chord in the key of B flat major. And then we get D, D, F, and B flat, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. E flat, C, G, and C. C minor over E flat, which is 2, 6. Then we get F, F, C, and E flat. And this is an incomplete 7 chord, but I am going to analyze it to make sense of the fact that 2 is, if we don't take into account what's happening on the end of the beat, 2 is going directly to 1, and this is not a 2-to-1 progression. This is definitely a 2-5-1 progression, but the figured bass would be 7-5 because the chord lacks a third, just like a lot of the open fifths we saw in the previous system. But after our 5-7 chord, we get 1, like I said, B flat, F, and D, root position. And then we get some passing tones in the inner voices, which don't lead to a chord we can analyze. It's kind of like a cluster, or like a B flat, C, D, and E flat. Yeah, just a cluster. And then we get B natural, D, D, and D. Another one of these sort of triple thirds chords where actually the tenor and the alto are doubled this time. So I think what's happening here is this is 7 of 2, again with chromatic bass lines. Usually the chromatic note's a secondary leading tone when it's in an ascending configuration like this. So 7 of 2, because B is the leading tone to C, and C is our supertonic. But you could analyze this starting from really at any point here in the key of G minor. It just doesn't really sound G minor like until we get close to the cadence, just for me. C, G, G, and C, another open fifth, but I'm going to assume that this is our 2 chord based on context. We also have a passing tone here in the tenor, and I do think we do move to the key of G minor here, and C minor becomes our 4 chord. We then get G, B flat, G, and B flat. A lot of incomplete chords here. This is a much more common spelling. This is our tonic G minor, passing tone in the tenor, and then we get our 5 chord D, D, F sharp, and A, D major. Next phrase is another one of these quick flips to the key of C minor. I think we end in a half cadence. In fact, now that I think about it, there's not a single authentic cadence in this chorale from the way that I've analyzed it. They're all half cadences, or otherwise there's one deceptive cadence. So we start the phrase off in the key of G minor as well. We get B flat, D, D, and G, which is 1/6, G minor over B flat. And then we get F sharp, A, D, and A, which is our 5 chord in first inversion, kind of harkening back to how we started the chorale off, that progression, or rather kind of at the beginning of the chorale. And then we get G minor in root position, G, G, D, and B flat, passing tone here in the tenor, and then we get E flat, B flat, E flat, and G flat. Sorry, G flat would be very interesting. That's G natural, which is our 6 chord E flat major. We then get A, C, C, and G. I think there is definitely something interesting going on here with this chord. It's definitely a subdivided chord progression because of how the chord moves to 4 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm as well. So this is an incomplete 2 chord in the key of G minor. I'm going to assume that it's half diminished, but it technically could be a minor 7 chord here, but we have nothing to indicate that we have melodic minor. No E naturals, no F sharps. In fact, we have the opposite going down here, which is usually the case when we see the melodic minor scale going down. But I'm going to say that this is actually our common chord to the key of C minor, where actually A diminished is our, or even, yeah, what would it be? It'd be A minor 7 flat 5, which would be like a 6/7 chord. That with the subdivision, because of that B natural, I feel like this A sort of coincides with, oh, you know what? You could also analyze it from this E flat chord here. I don't think it makes too much of a difference, actually. I take that back. You could say that E flat is 3 in the key of C minor, and that takes us to 6. But, you know, it's really 6 of one, half dozen of another in this case. It doesn't make too much of a difference because they're both chords that are diatonic to the key. And really, E flat isn't inherently more C minor like than it is G minor like, and A turns into melodic minor in terms of C on the beat, the first beat of the measure anyways. So I'll stick to this analysis. And then we get B natural, G, which is a chord tone, D, and F, which is G7 over B, that's 5/6/5. And then we get C minor, C, G, E flat, and E flat. They're doubled here. And we get some more voice crossing here in the alto and the soprano. But that's our tonic triad with the passing tone again in the alto. And then we get G major, presumably G major, G, 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 and D. It's possible that we're still in the key of G minor here, but I think with the B natural, it's a little difficult to make that argument, especially just with this rising figure here, starting from C and going up to G here in the alto. But regardless, we're going to make our way back to G minor by the end of the chorale. We end with a half cadence, which is an interesting thing. We would expect an authentic cadence at the end of most chorales, but here's a case where that convention is broken. But we start off in the key of C minor. We get D, B flat, F, and F, which is 7/6. We saw a similar phrase beginning like this before as well. We saw it here in the first system. And then we get C, C, E flat, and F. I thought this was a typo at first, but no, it's not. It's almost like we have like a reverse suspension going on here, and it's almost like this is a tonic triad, but it's not quite. It's like a F minor 7 chord without the third, and what would it be? Second inversion, like 4, 4, 3, where we have the 4 and the 3 above it, but we don't have the A flat incorporated into this chord, which makes it very interesting. 7 going to 4 is kind of a unique progression in this context. But then we get B natural, D, D and G, where the alto and the tenor are singing the same again. That's 5/6, G major over B natural. And then we get our resolution, C, G, C, and G, C minor in root position, another open fifth. Very interesting. But afterwards, we get kind of a curious chord. We have a lower suspension, which kind of spells out a D minor 7 flat 5 over C chord, which would be 2/4/2. So you could analyze this as 2/4/2, but I don't think that's what's happening here, even though the bass resolves the way we would expect. The Roman numeral isn't typical, and I think really what's happening here is we're getting like a 7, maybe like a 7/8 suspension, or even a 9/10 suspension underneath the alto here, but in typical Bach fashion, he recontextualizes the chord by introducing this D here in the tenor, which changes the chord to B natural, D, D, and F, which is our 7 chord in root position, B diminished. Lots of root position 7 chords, which are not exceptionally rare, but definitely less common than inverted 7 chords, that's for sure. We then get C, E flat, C, and E flat, which is our tonic triad in root position. C is a chord tone, and I think this is where we modulate. We get F sharp on the next beat, which is kind of a clue. Not necessarily a giveaway, but kind of a clue, especially because we're nearing the end of the chorale. And then we get F sharp, A, C, and D, which is D7 over F sharp, 5/6/5. Then we get G minor, G, G, B flat, and D, tonic triad, and then we end on our dominant, D, F sharp, A, and D, 5 chord root position. And that is today's analysis. Some of the takeaways from this chorale that just come to mind are the adjacent harmony. We actually have a really long adjacent harmonic phrase here. If you start from the beginning of the phrase, you get 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's pretty cool. He basically exhausts the whole scale from 6 to 6. That's pretty quirky. I don't think I've seen an adjacent harmonic phrase of that length in Bach's chorale writing, at least not one that I've been cognizant of. We then have a ton of open fifths. They're quite numerous, whether they're in the middle of the phrase or whether they're at the end of the phrase. Lots of open fifths in this chorale. I have a feeling they're going to be kind of common in the chorales at this stage of my journey to analyze all of the chorale harmonizations, because kind of the chorales that have come out of the woodwork as chorales that have survived but didn't make it into the early part of the BWV numbers are suspect for their own reasons, but still fascinating to analyze. Lots of chromaticism in the bass here. We have short ones, longer ones, and even little chromatic fragments going on here in little pairs of notes, but we have a couple of chromatic bass lines going on here. And then we have this irregular 4/2 resolution going on here in the bass, where we have G7 resolving to F sharp diminished. Very interesting how that's resolving, and I wonder exactly how that's working. It's kind of difficult to say if we're in the key of C minor at this point or if we're in the key of G minor. It just sounds too G minor like to me for me to make the call that it modulated, but you could analyze it in the key of C minor as well. I think that would be valid if you just rework the Roman numerals to reflect that. And this minor half cadence, you could analyze this in the key of G minor, and it would make a little bit, it would look a little bit more sensible on the page. But I really do think this is a minor half cadence. It wouldn't be the first minor half cadence we've seen in Bach if you've been following along. And I think those are the biggest takeaways from this chorale. I mean, I guess also the fact that there are no authentic cadences in this chorale, at least in the way that I analyze it. That's kind of interesting in and of itself. And other than that, really the harmony is, from a Roman numeral perspective, relatively straightforward. Definitely kind of quirky, but relatively straightforward. So I think I'm going to cap the video off on those thoughts. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon and like the video as well if you enjoy the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.